G'day everybody. Just recently I uploaded a YouTube video here about the light meter on your camera and why your camera actually has a light meter. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to adjust the light meter, and I'm going to teach you about the three basic fundamentals that you need to know about controlling your light meter. They are your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO. So in this short video, you're going to learn the importance of all those three things and how they all fit in together to make sure that you get your light meter in the right spot. Rightio folks, right here I have my old workhorse. This is my Canon EOS 600D. I've had a lot of photos printed in magazines with this camera. Now on this particular camera, you'll see the little dial at the top here that I'm turning. That's right next to the shutter button. That is to adjust your shutter speed. And in the case of this camera, it's also to adjust the aperture. With this particular camera, to set the aperture, you have to push this little AV button with the plus and minus symbol on it. You push that and you turn the knob at the same time. That's how you adjust the aperture with this camera. And the shutter speed is adjusted there, and the ISO is adjusted by pushing the ISO button and bringing up your different ISO speeds down the bottom here. Then you just set the one that you want. That's the Canon 600D. I'll also show you how to adjust the ISO, shutter and aperture on the Canon 70D in a minute as well. This to give you an idea of different sorts of cameras. Rightio everybody, this is a Canon EOS 70D. Earlier with the 70D and any series from the 2-digit number, whether it's the 70D, 80D, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20 or 10D, they all have the shutter up here, the same as all Canon cameras and most cameras in the world today, but they have the aperture control down here. So rather than having to push one button and turn a knob, you can quickly change your aperture by turning this little dial down the bottom here, this little wheel. So they're a bit easier to operate, and as with most cameras, there is an ISO button up the top here to adjust, to push to adjust the ISO. Right, so let's talk about the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO. I'm using the 70D here. I've got the viewfinder flipped out. It's in movie mode there now, so I'll put it into camera mode. We can see here I'm on ISO 200, aperture f1.4 and shutter speed 1600. They're the things that we can control. The first thing you need to think about, and the most important thing, is to always make sure you've got the lowest possible ISO setting. The ISO is the light sensitivity, so I'm going to push ISO and I'm going to put that down to 100. I don't put it in auto. I never use auto for ISO. In fact, I never use auto when I'm shooting in manual for anything except white balance. So it's in ISO 100 now. Now we can have a look at the light meter. Remember last week we spoke about the light meter? Let's go to compose a photo. It's saying it's about right. It's where it's going to be. The light meter is pretty good. We should get a pretty good photo, maybe a little overexposed. So I've got the timer on, but that's okay. Now you can see there the photo's okay. Now if I'm shooting a subject that's really close, f1.4 will give me a very blurry background. That's a very fast lens. So say I'm taking a landscape photo and I want everything in focus. I'll up the aperture, so I can up the aperture there. See, that's going up. Let's take the ISO, so let's take the shutter speed down. Now where's the light meter? No, way too dark. See here, it's right down the end. So we'll keep going, we'll keep going, we'll keep going. So in this lighting conditions, I can shoot at f13 and 1/20th of a second. So if I take that photo now, I'll get perfect light. Now that's good because it's sitting on a log and it's nice and stable. If I took that handheld at 1/20th of a second, I'd probably get a blurry photo because the shutter's too slow. Rule of thumb for most lenses, particularly sort of portrait lenses and wide angle lenses, 1/60th of a second. Anything lower than that, and you really should put it on a tripod. There's a lot of variations to that rule, but that's just the rule of thumb. So pretend I'm hand holding this and I think f1/20th is too slow. I don't want it to be any slower than 1/60th. I've got two options. I can up the ISO. Let's try it at 200 and see what happens. Then that gives me 1/40th. It's still a bit slow. So I can up the ISO to say 400. Then I can speed the shutter up. Look at that, 1/80th. So the same aperture, but it gives me 1/80th of a second and I get a good photo with the right light. The problem is, with higher ISOs, you lose a lot of ability to crop your images. If your image if you need to crop it, if you're taking a bird photo or something and you crop right in tight with 400 ISO, the quality is not going to be there. So you want to try and shoot at the lowest ISO possible. And in good daylight conditions like now, shooting at ISO 100 is fine. So I'll go back down to 100, which, as I stated a minute ago, will which will make it underexposed. So it's now way down there on the -2. So you have a look at 1/80th. A little bit dark, so I need to go back to 1/20th, but I don't want to be at 1/20th because that's too slow for handheld. So the other thing I've got to adjust is the aperture. So I'll lower the aperture. When I lower the aperture, that lets more light in. Look at that. f7.1 gives me 1/60th of a second and perfect light at ISO 100. So there we can see. If I up the ISO, it makes the photo brighter. If I lower the aperture, it makes the photo brighter. And if I slow the shutter speed down, it makes the photo brighter. If I slow the shutter speed down, the photo can become prone to camera shake or motion blur. Even if you're holding the camera still and you've got an image stabilized lens, but it's windy like it is now and the leaves are just moving around a bit, you'll get blurry leaves, but you'll get still everything else. So a slow shutter can produce motion blur or camera shake. Now the aperture, when you're shooting things away from the camera, you can get away with a low aperture. But if you're shooting at something close to the camera and you want the background sharp, you have to have a high aperture. For just a photo like this one, even though it's crooked, if I was just taking a landscape photo like this, f2.8 or f3.5 is probably way more than adequate. But if I was photographing something close to the camera and I wanted everything in focus, I'd have to up the aperture, in which case I'd have to adjust the ISO. So the trade-offs here, the shutter speed, if it's too slow, you get camera shake and motion blur, so you get blurry photos. If the aperture is too low, you'll get a blurry background. If you want a blurry background, that's fine. If you don't want a blurry background, you need to up your aperture. And the ISO, you want to shoot the lowest possible, because as you take the ISO up, you get grain. Back in the film days, we used to call them grainy photos. These days we call them noisy photos, sensor noise or pixel noise. So rule of thumb, the lowest ISO possible. The aperture, wherever you want it, depending on what sort of photo you're taking. For wildlife, you can get away with a low aperture, no worries. And your shutter speed, you don't really want any less than 1/60th. But you need to keep the light meter in the centre, as we said last week. Let's just hypothetically say that I've got a model, a very attractive model. Say myself, we'll use myself for an example. Standing in front of the camera, we might want a really low shutter speed. We might want a really low aperture, because we want that nice blurry, smooth background so that I'm the centre of attention in the photo. We can go right down to f4, and look at that. It's way up there, so we can get a real, look at that, 1/1250th of a second. We will get a great photo, and you'll never get any handshake in a photo with a shutter that fast, unless you're using a big, long telephoto lens. So that's fine for portrait sort of work. But if you want a high aperture photo, say you're photographing flowers, and you're in a garden bed, and you don't just want the front two flowers in focus, you want them all in focus, including the front and the back, then you're going to need the highest aperture possible if you're up nice and close. So with this lens, it'll go up to f16, which means we've got to really let a lot more light in, 1/8, 1/10 of a second. On a tripod or on a log in this case, that's fine. Listen to it. You can actually hear it being slower. But that's no good handheld, so you would have to up your ISO to at least 400, I reckon. What does that give us? That gives us 1/40th. No, I'd probably go a bit higher again. I'd go to 800, and that gives us 1/80th. So just to finalise, a basic rule of thumb, you want the lowest ISO that you can get away with given the light conditions. Okay, if it's dark, if it's evening, after sunset, at night, when you've got no other choice, you have to lift the ISO. When your aperture just won't go any lower and you can't afford a slow shutter speed, you've got no option but to raise your ISO. And let me just tell you, coming from a film background back in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, ISO is way different than what it used to be. Back then, 400 speed ISO photos weren't great. 800 speed, you just couldn't even use. They were just crap. 800 speed on these modern day digital SLR cameras, they're just brilliant for printing. There's no problems at all. So to get the crispest image you can, try and use the lowest ISO you've got. For a landscape photo like this, I'd probably say, just speaking from experience, f8. Nah, go a bit lower because I want that faster shutter speed. That'll be a good setting. 1/100th, f5, ISO 100, and that should give me, and the light meter's in the center where I want it, and that should give me a nice, well exposed photo. Marvellous. I hope you found this useful, and don't forget to subscribe and keep up to date when I update new tips and tricks as I go. Thank you very much for watching.